Focus on solutions, not problems. Something is happening inside your mind right now that you probably don't know about. Not something dramatic, not something you'd notice if nobody pointed it out, but something quiet, constant, and enormously consequential. A background process running beneath every thought you have, every decision you make, every goal you pursue. Your brain is scanning for what's wrong right now as you read this. It's cataloging threats, flagging problems, circling everything that feels broken or uncertain or risky. And the reason it's doing this isn't because something is wrong with you. It's because something is very, very right about a piece of biological hardware that was built for a completely different world than the one you're actually living in. Here's what nobody tells you about that hardware. It was designed for survival, not success. And in the life you're actually trying to build, the career, the relationships, the goals, the version of yourself you're working toward, survival mode thinking isn't just unhelpful, it's actively in your way. Every day you spend focused on problems is a day you didn't spend building solutions. Every hour you invest in analyzing what's wrong is an hour you didn't invest in creating what's right. And over weeks, months, years, that gap compounds into something that looks a lot like a life that never quite reached what it could have been. But here's the thing that changes everything. The way your brain processes challenges right now is not fixed. It's not your personality. It's not your fate. It's a pattern. And patterns can be changed. This isn't about positive thinking. It's not about pretending problems don't exist or painting a fake smile over genuine difficulty. This is about something far more practical and far more powerful. Training your brain to move through problems instead of living inside them. To ask different questions. To see what others miss. To become someone who finds the way forward when everyone else is still standing around discussing why the path is blocked. By the time you finish this, you'll understand exactly why your brain defaults to problems, what it costs you when it does, and, most importantly, the specific, practical, immediately applicable shifts that will start changing how you think today, not someday, today. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Problem-Focused Trap You Don't Know You're In. Let's start with something that might sting a little, but only because it's true. Most of the time you spend thinking about your problems is not moving you closer to solving them. Think about the last significant challenge you faced. Maybe it was a work situation that wasn't going the way you wanted, a relationship tension that kept resurfacing, a goal that felt further away the harder you tried, a decision you couldn't seem to make. Now honestly ask yourself, what did you do with that challenge? If you're like most people, genuinely, the vast majority of people, you thought about it a lot. You turned it over in your mind during your commute. You mentioned it to a friend over coffee and then mentioned it again. You lay awake at 2 a.m. with it running in the background like a tab you can't close. You became, gradually and without realizing it, something of an expert on the problem itself. But how much of that thinking time was actually generative? How much of it produced options, possibilities, directions forward? Probably not much, because there's a crucial difference between thinking about a problem and thinking through a problem. And most of us spend almost all our time doing the first one while believing we're doing the second. This is the problem-focused trap, and it's so pervasive, so normalized, so built into how we're taught to approach difficulty that most people never even question it. Watch what happens in a typical team meeting when something goes wrong. The first 15 minutes, sometimes the entire meeting, gets devoted to reconstructing exactly what happened, who did what, why it went sideways, what warning signs were missed. Everyone becomes an analyst of the failure, and by the time the meeting ends, the team has a remarkably thorough understanding of the problem and almost no plan for what to do about it. Watch what happens when someone faces a personal setback. They call their most trusted friend. They explain the situation in detail. The friend listens, asks questions, and together they build an increasingly complete picture of everything that's wrong. The conversation might last an hour. It might last several. And at the end of it, both people feel slightly better, because being heard feels good, but nothing has actually changed about the situation. This pattern is everywhere. In homes, offices, schools, conversations, and most critically, inside your own head. And here's what makes it so insidious. Problem-focused thinking feels productive while it's happening when you're deeply analyzing a challenge, when you're cataloging every angle of what went wrong, when you're identifying every obstacle in your path. Your brain experiences this as important work. It registers as effort. It generates the subjective sensation of progress. But you're not making progress. You're just getting better at seeing problems. And the more skilled you become at seeing problems, the more problems you see. The more problems you see, the more overwhelmed you feel. The more overwhelmed you feel, the less likely you are to take meaningful action. The less action you take, the more problems accumulate. Around and around it goes. A closed loop with no exit, mistaken for productivity the entire time. The people who genuinely break through, not just occasionally, but consistently, have found the exit from this loop. Not by being smarter than everyone else, not by having fewer problems, but by training themselves to respond to challenges differently from the first moment of contact. When something goes wrong in their world, their brain's first move isn't to analyze the problem, it's to start generating responses to it. Their default question isn't what's wrong here. It's what do I do now? That shift sounds small. It isn't. It's the difference between being someone who gets stuck and someone who keeps moving, and it's completely learnable. Chapter 2. Why your brain is wired this way and what it's costing you. Before we talk about how to change this pattern, you need to understand why it exists in the first place. Because once you understand the mechanism, you stop taking it personally. You stop treating it as evidence that something is wrong with you, and you start seeing it for what it actually is: outdated software running on remarkable hardware. Your brain has a deeply embedded tendency to prioritize negative information over positive information, not because it's pessimistic, but because, for most of human history, negative information was more immediately important for survival. The person who noticed the danger signal and took it seriously lived longer than the person who didn't. The person who cataloged threats and potential problems was more likely to see their children grow up. This tendency got passed down, refined, reinforced across generations of human experience until it became essentially automatic, a default mode of processing that kicks in without you having to choose it. The problem is that your brain can't tell the difference between a genuinely life-threatening situation and a work deadline. It can't distinguish between a predator in the grass and a difficult conversation with your manager. To your nervous system, a challenge is a challenge, and its response to a challenge is to flood your system with stress chemistry, and lock your attention onto everything that could go wrong. This is useful if you're navigating actual physical danger. It's not useful when you're trying to solve a business problem, navigate a relationship conflict, or figure out how to reach a goal that currently feels out of reach. In those situations, the stress response actively works against you. It narrows your thinking at exactly the moment when you need it to be broad. It focuses your attention on threats at exactly the moment when you need to be generating options. It makes you feel urgency without giving you direction, which is one of the most exhausting and least productive mental states a human being can be in. There's something else compounding this. Once your brain decides something is a problem, once it has labeled and categorized a situation as threatening or negative, it starts looking for evidence to confirm that assessment. It becomes selectively attentive to information that supports the problem narrative and selectively inattentive to information that might challenge it or point toward solutions. So not only does your brain default to problem-focused thinking, it then actively filters reality to make the problem seem more solid, more permanent, and more overwhelming than it actually is. Add to this the environment most of us live in. Every news source you consume is optimized to highlight what's going wrong because difficulty and danger capture attention more reliably than progress and possibility. Every social platform you use is built on algorithms that amplify content, triggering emotional reactions. And the emotions that get the strongest reactions are usually fear, outrage, and anxiety. You're not just fighting your own wiring. You're fighting an entire information environment that profits from keeping your attention locked on problems. But here's what shifts everything. All of this is programming. And programming, unlike hardware, can be updated. Your brain's tendency to default to problem-focused thinking is not a permanent feature of who you are. It's a deeply worn groove in how you process experience. And grooves worn over time can be worn differently over time. Every single time you catch yourself spiraling into problem analysis and consciously redirect toward solution thinking, you're doing something real and physical inside your brain. You're reinforcing a different pathway. You're making a different response slightly more automatic than it was before. And over time, not overnight, but over consistent time, that different response becomes your new default. This is not motivational language. This is how the brain actually works, and understanding it changes the entire relationship you have with the pattern you're trying to change. You're not fighting your nature, you're updating it. Chapter 3. The fundamental shift that changes everything. Now we get to the heart of it, not just why your brain defaults to problems, but what a genuinely different approach actually looks and feels like from the inside. Because here's what most personal development content gets wrong about. Solution-focused thinking, it presents it as an attitude, a choice to be positive, a decision to look on the bright side. And while attitude matters, that framing misses the deeper truth. Solution-focused thinking is not an emotional stance. It's a cognitive operating system, a different set of questions that produce different information, a different relationship to challenges that produces different responses, and ultimately, a different set of results that produce a different life. The operating system shift starts with one foundational assumption. Every challenge contains within it the information needed to move forward. Not necessarily the complete solution, but always something, a data point, a direction, A constraint that, once understood clearly, reveals what the real problem actually is and therefore what a real solution might look like. Problem-focused people look at a challenge and see an obstacle, something in the way, something to be gotten around or waited out or complained about. Solution-focused people look at the same challenge and see data, information about reality, something that, properly understood, will point toward what needs to happen next. This isn't a personality difference, it's a question difference. When something goes wrong for a problem-focused person, the questions that arise are, why is this happening? Who's responsible? Why does this always happen to me? How bad could this get? These questions are natural. They emerge from the stress response we talked about. But notice what kind of information they produce. They produce explanations, attributions, and worst-case scenarios, none of which help you move forward. When something goes wrong for a solution-focused person, the questions are different. What's actually true about this situation? What do I have available to work with? What would need to be different for this to improve? What's one thing I could do right now that would help? Notice what these questions produce. They produce options, directions, starting points. Your brain is, among many things, an incredibly powerful answer-generating machine. But it can only search for the kinds of answers its questions point toward. Ask it why things are bad, and it will find you evidence of badness. Ask it what you can do, and it will start generating things you can do. The quality of your thinking is largely determined by the quality of your questions, and you have more control over your questions than you probably realize. There's another dimension to this shift that matters enormously. It's about where you locate agency, your sense of who is actually in charge of what happens to you. Problem-focused thinking tends to locate agency outside yourself. Things are the way they are because of circumstances, other people, bad timing, bad luck. The problem is real and external, and you are subject to it. This isn't always conscious, but it's the underlying assumption that drives a lot of reactive, stuck thinking. Solution-focused thinking locates agency inside yourself, not in a naive everything is my fault way, but in a genuinely empowering practical way. The question isn't whether external circumstances exist and constrain you. They obviously do. The question is, given the reality I'm actually in, what can I do? What can I influence? Where can I move? This shift from external to internal agency is one of the most powerful moves available to a human being. And it's available right now in whatever situation you're currently facing. There's one more element worth naming here, because it shows up in the people who handle challenges most effectively. They have a deep, settled belief that solutions exist. Not that solutions are easy, not that solutions are obvious, not that solutions will emerge without effort, but that solutions are there, waiting to be found by someone who looks carefully enough and thinks creatively enough and persists long enough. This belief isn't blind optimism. It's grounded in something real, the consistent pattern across human history that problems which seemed completely unsolvable eventually got solved. Not because the universe became kinder, but because people kept looking, kept asking, kept trying approaches that hadn't been tried yet. You don't need to know what the solution is to believe that one exists. You just need enough faith in the search to keep searching. Focused framework plus advanced strategies. Chapter 4, the framework that turns any problem into a starting point. Understanding the mindset is one thing. Having a repeatable process is another. And the difference between people who occasionally think about solutions and people who consistently find them is almost always this. The consistent ones have a system, not a complicated system, not something that requires special training or unusual intelligence, a simple, repeatable 5-step process that you can apply to any challenge. From the minor frustrations of a difficult week to the genuinely complex problems that have been sitting unsolved for months. Here's what makes this framework different from how most people approach problems. It separates the different phases of thinking that your brain needs to go through, and it does so in the right order. Because one of the biggest reasons people get stuck isn't that they lack the ability to find solutions. It's that they mix up their thinking phases. They evaluate ideas before they've generated enough of them. They try to implement before they've chosen wisely. They jump to action before they've understood what they're actually dealing with. This framework gives each phase its own space, and that separation is what makes it work. Step 1. Define what actually needs solving. This sounds obvious. It almost never is. Most people think they know what their problem is, but what they've actually identified is usually a symptom, the visible, surface-level manifestation of something deeper. And when you try to solve a symptom instead of the actual problem, you get temporary relief at best and wasted effort at worst. The key to this first step is describing your challenge in specific, factual, emotionally neutral terms. Not everything is falling apart, and I don't know what to do. But I've missed 3 project deadlines this month, and my manager has flagged it twice. Not my relationship is a disaster, but my partner and I have the same argument repeatedly, and it never resolves. Notice the difference. The first versions are emotionally loaded descriptions that activate your stress response and make the situation feel enormous and shapeless. The second versions are precise descriptions that give your brain something specific to work with. When you define a problem with precision, something interesting happens. It usually gets smaller, not because the situation has changed, but because precision strips away all the catastrophic interpretation that problem-focused thinking layers on top of reality. You're left with the actual thing that needs solving, which is almost always more manageable than the story you'd been telling yourself about it. One useful question here: what specifically would need to be different for this situation to be acceptable? That question cuts straight to the definition of what you're actually trying to change. Step 2. Take inventory of what you already have. Before you start generating solutions, you need to know what you're working with. And most people dramatically underestimate what they're working with, because problem-focused thinking creates a scarcity lens that makes resources feel thin even when they're not. Resources aren't just money, time, and expertise, though those matter. Resources include relationships you could activate, knowledge you've accumulated, past experiences that contain relevant lessons, skills you've developed that might apply in unexpected ways, people in your network who've navigated something similar, access to information you haven't fully explored yet. Take an honest inventory. Write it down if the situation warrants it. The act of externalizing your resources, getting them out of your head and onto paper, does something important. It makes them feel real and available in a way that mental cataloging often doesn't. This step matters because of what it does to your brain's orientation. When you're focused on what you lack, which is where problem-focused thinking goes by default, your brain operates from a sense of scarcity and limitation. When you consciously shift attention to what you have, your brain starts making connections. It starts seeing how resource A might combine with resource B to address the challenge in a way neither could alone. This is where creativity begins to emerge. Step 3. Generate options without judging them. This is the step most people skip, rush through, or collapse with the next step. And it's the step that makes the biggest difference in the quality of your eventual solution. Your brain has two distinct modes of thinking: generative and evaluative. Generative thinking produces ideas. Evaluative thinking assesses them. These modes genuinely work against each other when they're active simultaneously. When you judge an idea the moment it appears, you shut down the generative process because your brain learns quickly that producing ideas leads immediately to them being criticized, and it starts producing fewer of them. The goal of this step is pure quantity. You're not looking for the right answer yet. You're looking for as many possible answers as you can generate. Obvious ones, unconventional ones, expensive ones, free ones, fast ones, slow ones, ones that feel slightly crazy, all of them. To push past the first few obvious ideas, which are almost never the best ones, ask yourself some deliberately unusual questions. If I had to solve this in 24 hours with no budget, what would I try? That question forces unconventional thinking. What would someone who knows nothing about this field suggest? Outsider thinking often reveals approaches that insider expertise overlooks. What's the opposite of what I'd normally do? Sometimes the conventional approach is exactly what's keeping you stuck. The best solutions are rarely the first ones you think of. They emerge from the generative process itself. As one idea sparks another, as connections form between things that seemed unrelated, as the cumulative momentum of brainstorming opens up territory that careful analytical thinking would never have found. Step 4. Evaluate and choose. Now you switch modes. You take everything you generated in Step 3 and you apply analytical thinking to it, but with a specific structure, not just a gut feeling. Evaluate each option against a small set of practical criteria. How feasible is this given what I actually have available? How quickly could I implement it? How likely is it to address the real problem I defined in Step 1? What are the potential downsides or risks? You don't need an elaborate scoring system. What you need is honest evaluation that isn't distorted by either excessive optimism or excessive caution. The goal isn't to find the perfect solution. It's to find the best available solution given your current reality. This distinction matters enormously. Waiting for a perfect solution is one of the most common ways that solution-focused thinking stalls. Perfect solutions are rare. Good solutions, implemented consistently and refined over time, create the results that perfect solutions promise but rarely deliver. Choose the option that best balances impact, feasibility, and timing, and commit to it genuinely, not as a tentative experiment you'll abandon at the first sign of difficulty, but as a real direction you're moving in. Step 5. Implement, track, and adjust. This is where solution-focused thinking diverges most sharply from problem-focused thinking, because problem-focused thinkers often treat the identification of a solution as the end of the process. They had the insight. They figured it out. Done. But insights don't change anything. Actions do. And actions need to be sustained, monitored, and adjusted based on what actually happens when they meet reality. Build a simple implementation plan. What specifically are you going to do? When? How? Will you know if it's working? What will you adjust if the initial results aren't what you hoped for? That last question is particularly important. Most solutions require refinement. The first version rarely works perfectly. But people who've been conditioned by problem-focused thinking often interpret early imperfect results as evidence that the solution doesn't work and abandon it before they've given it a real chance or before they've made the adjustments that would have made it effective. Treat your initial implementation as version 1, not the final answer. Stay curious about what the results are telling you. Adjust based on evidence. Keep moving. Chapter 5. Advanced Strategies for Problems That Won't Budge. The 5-step framework handles most of what life throws at you. But there's a category of challenge that resists straightforward approaches. Complex, layered problems where the obvious solutions don't work, where multiple variables interact in ways that are hard to track, where you've already tried several things and none of them have made a meaningful dent. These problems need more sophisticated tools, and the people who solve them aren't necessarily smarter than everyone else. They're using different lenses, different mental models that reveal aspects of the problem that conventional thinking can't see. The first advanced strategy is learning to see systems instead of incidents. When something goes wrong repeatedly, when the same problem keeps appearing no matter how many times you address it, you're almost certainly dealing with a system issue, not an incident issue. The problem isn't the specific thing that went wrong. The problem is the structure that keeps producing that outcome. Most people respond to recurring problems by trying harder at the surface level. They work longer hours to address the time management problem. They have the same conversation again to address the communication problem. They apply more willpower to address the habit problem. And then they're baffled when the problem reappears because they've been treating symptoms while the underlying system remains unchanged. Seeing systems means stepping back from the specific incident and asking, what is the broader pattern here? What structures, processes, or habits are consistently producing this outcome? It means looking for the place in the chain where a relatively small change would produce outsized results. What engineers call a leverage point. When you find a leverage point, you stop having to work so hard. A small, well-placed change in the right part of the system accomplishes what enormous effort at the wrong part never could. Ask yourself, if this problem is a symptom, what's the disease? That question shifts your focus from the surface to the structure. And structure is where durable solutions live. The second advanced strategy is constraint mapping. Every situation has constraints, things that genuinely limit your options. But not all constraints are equal. Some are real and fixed, others are assumed and flexible. And one of the most common reasons people get stuck is that they're working around constraints that don't actually exist, or treating negotiable limitations as if they were absolute. When a problem feels impossible, make a list of every constraint that seems to be making it so. Then go through that list and ask honestly about each one. Is this actually fixed, or does it just feel fixed because I haven't questioned it yet? You'll often find that several of the constraints you've been treating as immovable are actually assumptions about what's acceptable, what's possible, what's allowed, what people will agree to. And when you remove or modify those assumed constraints, the solution space expands dramatically. Real constraints are worth knowing clearly, too, because once you know exactly what you're actually working within, you can focus your creative energy on what's genuinely available rather than bumping repeatedly against walls that aren't there. The third advanced strategy is borrowing solutions. You rarely face a problem that no one has ever encountered before. The specific details differ, but the underlying structure of most challenges, communication breakdowns, resource limitations, motivation gaps, coordination failures, growth plateaus, these are deeply human problems that people have been navigating in various forms for a very long time, which means somewhere, someone has found a way through something similar to what you're facing. And studying how they did it, not to copy it blindly, but to extract the underlying principle, can compress your timeline from months to days. The key is looking for principles rather than tactics. A tactic is a specific action that worked in a specific context. A principle is the underlying logic that made that action effective. And principles travel across contexts in ways that tactics often don't. When you study how someone else solved a similar problem, ask, what was the core insight that made their approach work? What assumption did they question that others hadn't? What resource did they see that others missed? Extract that, and you have something transferable. Studying failures is equally valuable, sometimes more so. Understanding why certain approaches didn't work, and specifically why, saves you from the expensive and demoralizing experience of discovering those failure modes yourself. The fourth advanced strategy is building solutions that improve through use. Most people think of solutions as static. You find the right answer, you implement it, it either works or it doesn't. But the most durable and effective solutions are dynamic. They're designed from the start to learn and improve based on what actually happens when they meet reality. This means building feedback loops into whatever you implement. Regular check-ins where you honestly assess whether the approach is working. Clear metrics that tell you something real rather than just something reassuring. A genuine willingness to revise based on what the data shows, even when revision is uncomfortable, even when it means acknowledging that your initial approach wasn't quite right. The mindset that makes this possible is seeing your initial implementation not as a bet you need to win, but as an experiment designed to generate information. When you're running an experiment, results that don't match your hypothesis aren't failures, they're findings. They tell you something important about reality that will help you design the next iteration better. This approach is particularly powerful for complex problems because it doesn't require you to be right from the start. It requires you to be honest about what's happening and willing to adjust. Those are skills anyone can develop, and they'll carry you further than being right ever will. The fifth advanced strategy is thinking in combinations. Simple problems often have simple solutions. Complex problems rarely do. And one of the most common mistakes people make when facing genuine complexity is continuing to search for a single solution when what the situation actually calls for is several smaller solutions working together. This is what's sometimes called stacking, identifying the multiple components that make up a complex challenge, developing targeted responses to each component, and then thinking carefully, about how those responses interact and reinforce each other. The power of this approach is that it allows you to make progress on a large problem without needing to solve all of it at once. You identify which component, if addressed, would create the most positive impact on the others. You start there, you build momentum, and as each piece comes together, the overall problem starts becoming more tractable, because you're no longer facing the full complexity of the original challenge, but a progressively simpler version of it. The sequencing of your solutions matters as much as the solutions themselves. Some solutions create prerequisites for others. Some solutions, implemented together, reinforce each other in ways that make both more effective. Think not just about what to do, but about what order to do it in. And you'll find that the same set of solutions, properly sequenced, produces far better results than they would in a random order. Brain reprogramming plus reframing. Chapter 6. How to rewire your brain for automatic solution finding. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Everything you've read so far, the framework, the strategies, the mindset shifts, none of it will change your life if it stays in the category of things you intellectually understand but don't actually do differently. And the reason most people don't do things differently, even when they understand why they should, isn't laziness. It isn't lack of motivation. It's something more fundamental. Their brain's automatic responses haven't changed. They understand solution-focused thinking consciously, but the moment a real challenge arrives, especially a stressful, high-stakes, emotionally charged one, their brain reverts to its deeply worn default patterns: problem analysis, threat scanning, worry loops, the same grooves it's always run in. So the question isn't just how to think about solutions, it's how to make solution-focused thinking automatic, how to rewire the default so that your brain reaches for solution-generating questions before it reaches for problem-amplifying ones, without you having to consciously force it every single time. This is possible. It's not instant, but it's more achievable than most people realize, because your brain is genuinely plastic. It changes based on what you do repeatedly. And with the right techniques applied consistently, you can shift your default mode of operation more quickly than you'd expect. Here's how. The first technique is the pattern interrupt. Your brain runs on habits, not just behavioral habits, cognitive habits. The sequence of thoughts that unfolds when you encounter a challenge is largely automatic, running along well-established neural pathways before you've made any conscious decision about how to think about the situation. The pattern interrupt is a tool for catching that automatic sequence before it gains momentum and redirecting it before the problem-focused loop locks in. It works like this. The moment you notice yourself beginning to spiral into problem analysis, the moment you catch the familiar feeling of your thinking narrowing and darkening around a challenge, you immediately ask yourself one specific question. What's one thing I could do right now to move this forward? That question does something important. It doesn't deny the problem. It doesn't demand that you feel positive about a difficult situation. It simply redirects your brain's search function from cataloging what's wrong to generating what's possible. And because your brain is a remarkably obedient answer-generating machine, it will search for whatever you ask it to search for. At first, you'll need to apply this interrupt consciously and deliberately, which means you need to notice when the problem-focused loop is starting, which takes a little practice in itself. A useful tool here is setting a simple phone reminder, just once every hour or two during your waking day, with a single question: am I focused on the problem or the solution right now? Not as a judgment, just as a check-in. Over time, your brain starts asking this question automatically without the reminder. The check-in becomes internal. The goal isn't to never have problem-focused thoughts. They'll come. They're part of how your brain works. The goal is to catch them earlier, redirect them faster, and reduce the time you spend in the loop before shifting to more productive thinking. The second technique is deliberate input management. Your brain doesn't just respond to what happens to you. It's constantly being shaped by what you feed it. The information you consume, the content you read, watch, and listen to, the conversations you engage in, the environments you spend time in, all of it is training your brain's default patterns, whether you're aware of it or not. Most people's information diet is overwhelmingly problem-focused, not because they chose it that way, but because problem-focused content is more emotionally stimulating and therefore more algorithmically amplified. News, social media, casual conversation, all of it trends toward what's wrong, what's failing, what's threatening, what's broken, and your brain absorbs it all, quietly, consistently, shaping what feels normal, what feels possible, what your automatic first response is when you encounter a challenge in your own life. Changing this doesn't require dramatic withdrawal from the world. It requires deliberate curation. Start your mornings with content that shows you what's possible. Stories of people who navigated real difficulty and found ways through. Ideas about innovation and problem solving. Examples of human ingenuity and persistence. Not as a way to avoid reality, but as a way to prime your brain's search function for the kind of information that will actually help you. Pay attention to your conversational patterns as well. Notice how much of your time with other people is spent in collaborative problem analysis, commiserating, venting, cataloging what's going wrong. This isn't to say those conversations have no value. Sometimes being heard matters more than being helped. But if the majority of your social interaction is problem-focused, you're being trained socially, repeatedly, to default to problem-focused thinking. Introduce solution-oriented questions into your conversations. When a friend brings you a problem after you've listened genuinely, ask, "What do you think you could do?" Or "What would a first step look like?" When a colleague is stuck, ask, "What options haven't we fully explored yet?" These questions shift the conversational direction, and they train everyone in the conversation, including you, toward more generative thinking. Also look at your language, not in a forced, artificial way, but with genuine awareness. Problem-focused language uses words that emphasize limitation and permanence. "I can't. It's impossible. It never works. This always happens." Solution-focused language uses words that emphasize possibility and movement. "What if? How might I? There must be a way. What haven't I tried yet?" Your language doesn't just reflect your thinking, it reinforces it. Speak possibility into your own mind often enough, and your mind starts defaulting to it. The third technique is solution visualization. Your brain has a fascinating limitation. It processes vivid, emotionally engaged imagination in many of the same ways it processes actual experience. Which means that when you repeatedly and vividly imagine yourself responding to challenges in a solution-focused way of staying calm, asking the right questions, generating options, moving forward with confidence, you're building real neural pathways. You're practicing neurologically even when no real challenge is present. Spend 5 minutes daily on this. Find a quiet moment. Morning works particularly well because it primes your brain for the day ahead. Close your eyes and see yourself encountering a challenge. Feel the initial stress response. Don't skip past it, because that's realistic. Then watch yourself take a breath. Ask a solution-focused question and begin generating options. Feel what it's like to move through the challenge with clarity, rather than spinning in anxiety around it. See yourself implementing something, adjusting based on feedback, continuing forward. Make it as specific and sensory as possible. The more detail your visualization contains, the more real it feels to your brain, and the stronger the neural pathways it builds. Over time, this practice makes solution-focused responses feel familiar rather than effortful. Your brain has, in a sense, already been there. It knows the route. When a real challenge arrives, it reaches more readily for the response you've been rehearsing. The fourth technique is environmental design. Your physical and digital environment influences your thinking in ways that mostly happen beneath your conscious awareness. The things you see regularly, the spaces you work in, the objects that surround you, all of it sends signals to your brain about what kind of thinking is normal and expected here. Solution-focused people design their environments deliberately. They keep visible reminders of past challenges they've overcome, not as trophies, but as evidence. Evidence that they've found ways through difficulty before, which means they can find ways through difficulty again. They keep books and resources nearby that expand their problem-solving toolkit. They display their current goals and the specific actions they're taking toward them, which keeps their brain oriented toward forward movement rather than backward analysis. Your digital environment deserves equal attention. Curate your feeds to include people who share solutions, explore possibilities, and model the kind of thinking you're trying to build. Unfollow accounts that consistently generate anxiety without offering direction, not because you're hiding from reality, but because your attention is genuinely finite, and what you direct it toward shapes what your brain considers normal and possible. The fifth technique is finding an accountability partner. Your thinking patterns are social, not just individual. The people you spend the most time with have a profound influence on your default cognitive style, not through obvious persuasion, but through the subtle, constant modeling of how they approach challenges. Find one person who shares your commitment to solution-focused thinking and create a simple structure of mutual accountability. Check in weekly. Share a challenge you're facing and the solution approach you're taking. Ask each other, where did you catch yourself in problem-focused thinking this week? What did you do about it? Celebrate each other's shifts in thinking, not just each other's results. When someone outside your own head is tracking your patterns alongside you, progress accelerates dramatically. Not because external pressure is the most powerful motivator, but because articulating your approach to someone else clarifies it, and being seen in your commitment to change makes that commitment feel more real and more binding. Chapter 7. The Art of Reframing. Seeing what others miss. There's a skill that sits at the heart of solution-focused thinking and separates people who consistently find ways forward from those who consistently feel stuck. It's not intelligence. It's not information. It's something more fundamental than either. The ability to change the frame through which you're looking at a situation. Reframing isn't spin. It's not pretending a difficult situation is actually fine. It's the deliberate practice of examining a challenge from multiple angles until you find the perspective that reveals the most useful information and opens the most productive path forward. And here's the practical truth about reframing. The frame you're currently using to look at any problem is not the objective, neutral, only possible view of that situation. It's one interpretation, one way of organizing the available information, and there are always others, some of which will show you things the current frame is hiding. The first reframing tool is the opportunity scan. When you encounter a challenge, your brain's default frame is loss. Something has gone wrong. Something you had or wanted is threatened. The entire cognitive orientation is toward what's being taken away or blocked. The opportunity scan deliberately asks the opposite question. What does this situation make possible that didn't exist before? This isn't toxic positivity. Not every challenge is secretly a gift, but almost every challenging situation genuinely does open up something, a necessity that forces you to develop a capability you've been avoiding, a disruption that creates space for a better alternative, a failure that reveals a flaw in your approach that would have caused far bigger problems later. A sudden change in your professional situation might feel like a setback, and in some ways, it genuinely is. But it also creates freedom you didn't have before, removes a constraint that was limiting your growth, and forces engagement with options you'd been postponing because the status quo was comfortable enough. The opportunity scan doesn't deny the loss. It asks what the loss makes possible. Ask yourself 3 specific questions when you encounter any significant challenge. What could this teach me that I wouldn't have learned otherwise? What does navigating this well make me capable of that I wasn't before? What possibility exists now that didn't exist before this happened? Your brain will find answers to whatever questions you ask it. These questions send it in a direction that problem-focused thinking never goes. The second reframing tool is competitive response thinking. Every challenge you face is, in most cases, also being faced by others in your field, your community, or your life context. The circumstances aren't unique to you. What's unique is how you respond to them. And this creates a question that reframes difficulty from a threat into a differentiating opportunity. How can I respond to this in a way that creates an advantage while others are focused on just surviving it? When conditions get difficult in any environment, the majority of people contract. They get cautious, defensive, focused on protection. They pour their energy into maintaining what they have rather than building something new. This is understandable. It's also exactly when the gap between contracted and expansive thinking becomes most consequential. The people and organizations that come out of difficult periods stronger than they entered them are almost never the ones who hunkered down and waited it out. They're the ones who saw the difficulty as a context and asked what was now possible in that context that hadn't been possible before. Which positions were now available? Which relationships could now be built? Which capabilities could now be developed while others were too busy managing their anxiety to develop anything? You don't have to be callous about difficulty to think this way. You can acknowledge that a situation is genuinely hard while simultaneously asking how to respond to it in a way that builds something rather than just endures something. The third reframing tool is the investment lens. Problem-focused thinking treats challenges as costs. They drain your time, energy, attention, and emotional resources. They take from you. And so the goal becomes minimizing them, getting through them as quickly as possible, and returning to the state before they arrived. The investment lens flips this. It asks, what am I gaining from navigating this challenge well? Think about the genuinely difficult things you've already been through, the situations that felt at the time like they were depleting you. What did those experiences actually give you? Almost certainly, capabilities you didn't have before, resilience you hadn't tested, clarity about what actually matters to you, relationships that formed or deepened under pressure, a track record of having gotten through hard things, which is one of the most valuable resources a person can have, because it changes the relationship you have with every future hard thing. The challenge you're currently navigating is building something in you. The question is whether you're building it consciously, extracting the lessons, developing the capabilities, letting the experience strengthen rather than just exhaust you, or whether you're building it accidentally while focused entirely on just getting to the other side. The fourth reframing tool is story restructuring. Your brain makes sense of your life through narrative, not just occasionally, constantly. You are always beneath your conscious awareness, telling yourself a story about what's happening and why and what it means about you and what's likely to happen next. And the story you're telling determines, more than almost anything else, how you feel and what you do. Problem-focused people tend toward what might be called passive narratives, stories where things happen to them, where circumstances are the primary agents and they are subject to those circumstances. These stories feel realistic because they acknowledge real difficulty, but they're subtly disempowering because they locate the action outside the self. Solution-focused people tend toward active narratives, stories where they are the primary agent, where challenges are things they're navigating rather than things happening to them, where setbacks are chapters rather than conclusions. Both narratives can describe the same external events. The difference is entirely in how those events are interpreted, and that interpretation is something you have genuine influence over. This week, pay attention to the story you're telling yourself about your current challenges. Not to judge it, just to notice it. Is it a story where you're moving through difficulty, or a story where difficulty is happening to you? And if you were going to revise it, keeping all the facts, changing only the interpretation, what would the revised story say? That revised story isn't denial. It's a more useful and more accurate account of what's actually true, that you are a person with agency, navigating real challenges, with more resources and options available than your problem-focused default is likely showing you. Solution-focused communication plus building confidence plus thinking under pressure. Chapter 8. How you talk about problems changes everything. Here's something most people never consider. The way you communicate about challenges doesn't just reflect your thinking, it shapes it. Every conversation you have about a difficulty is either training your brain and everyone else in the conversation to see more problems or training it to find more solutions. There's no neutral ground here. Language is not a passive vehicle for thought. It's an active participant in creating it. And once you understand this, you'll start noticing it everywhere, in the meetings that drain everyone's energy without producing any direction, in the conversations that somehow make a problem feel bigger after an hour of discussing it than it did before, in the internal monologue that loops endlessly around what's wrong without ever landing on what to do. Problem-focused communication has a specific signature. It's heavy on description and light on direction. It spends the majority of its time building a thorough, detailed, emotionally amplified picture of the problem, and very little time pointing toward what comes next. It asks questions that look for causes rather than solutions. It uses language that makes difficulties feel permanent and personal rather than temporary and situational. Solution-focused communication has a completely different feel. It acknowledges reality without amplifying it. It moves quickly from what's wrong to what's possible. It asks questions that open up thinking rather than closing it down. And it creates a specific kind of energy in a conversation, a sense of forward momentum, of problems being workable rather than insurmountable, of people having agency rather than being subject to circumstances. Learning to communicate this way is one of the highest leverage skills you can develop, not just for your own thinking, but for your influence on everyone around you. The first principle is acknowledgement without amplification. When something goes wrong, it needs to be acknowledged. Pretending difficulties don't exist isn't solution-focused thinking. It's avoidance, and it creates its own set of problems. People need to feel that their challenges are real and seen before they can move toward addressing them. But acknowledgement doesn't require dwelling. There's a difference between, I hear that this is a real difficulty, and I'm taking it seriously, and let's spend the next 40 minutes going deeper and deeper into exactly how difficult this is. The first creates the safety people need to engage. The second locks everyone into the problem and makes forward movement harder, not easier. In practice, this looks like naming the challenge clearly and briefly, without adding catastrophic interpretation, without inviting extended elaboration of how bad it is, and then pivoting to forward-facing questions. We're dealing with a real problem here, so let's figure out what we can do about it. That pivot, made consistently and with genuine warmth rather than cold efficiency, changes the entire direction of a conversation. The second principle is the question design. The questions you ask in a conversation about challenges are possibly the most powerful tool you have, because questions direct attention, and where attention goes, thinking follows. Problem-focused questions are backward-looking and cause-seeking. Why did this happen? Who's responsible? How did we end up here? Why does this keep occurring? These questions produce explanations. They might satisfy curiosity. They might assign accountability, but they rarely produce movement. Solution-focused questions are forward-looking and option-generating. What are our options? What have we not tried yet? What would need to be true for this to improve? What's the smallest step that would create meaningful progress? These questions produce direction. They engage people's creativity rather than their defensive instincts. They make the people in the conversation feel capable rather than implicated. Mastering this distinction will change every meeting you're in, every difficult conversation you have, and every problem-solving discussion you lead. The questions you ask are the architecture of the conversation. They determine what kind of thinking is possible within it. Practice catching yourself when you're about to ask a backward-facing, cause-seeking question and redirecting it forward. Instead of, "Why are we behind on this?" try what would get us back on track. Instead of, "How did this get so bad?" try, "What's the most impactful thing we could address first?" The information you get back will be more useful, and the conversation will feel completely different. The third principle is energy stewardship. Conversations have energy, and that energy is not fixed. It responds dynamically to the language, tone, and direction of what's being said. Problem-focused conversations are energetically expensive. They generate stress, anxiety, and a diffuse sense of heaviness that lingers after the conversation ends. People leave them feeling smaller than when they arrived, less capable, more overwhelmed, less certain that anything can actually improve. Solution-focused conversations do the opposite. Even when they're discussing real and serious difficulties, they create a sense of agency and forward momentum that leaves people feeling more capable, more resourceful, and more motivated to actually do something. This matters practically, not just emotionally. People who feel capable generate better ideas. People who feel overwhelmed generate worse ones, or none at all. By consistently steering conversations toward solution-oriented language and questions, you're not just making conversations feel better. You're literally increasing the quality of thinking available in those conversations. Notice what happens to the energy in a room when someone frames a challenge as "we're stuck and I don't know what to do," versus "we have a real challenge here and I want to think through it together." Same situation, completely different energy. And that energy difference determines what's cognitively available to everyone in the room. The fourth principle is assumption embedding. Every piece of communication carries embedded assumptions, invisible beliefs about what's possible, what's likely, and what people are capable of. These assumptions travel beneath the surface of the actual words, shaping how the people receiving them think and feel about the situation. Problem-focused communication tends to embed limiting assumptions. "This is going to be really difficult. I'm not sure we can handle it. There might not be a good answer here." These assumptions become self-fulfilling. People hear them, absorb them, and their thinking narrows accordingly. Solution-focused communication embeds expanding assumptions. "We'll figure this out. There's definitely a way forward here. We've handled harder things than this." These assumptions also become self-fulfilling. People hear them, and their thinking expands. Their confidence in the search for solutions rises, and confident searchers find solutions that discouraged ones miss. You have enormous influence over the assumptions your communication embeds, more than most people realize. Pay attention to what you're implying, not just what you're saying. The belief that solutions exist, communicated through your tone and framing, even when you don't yet know what they are, is one of the most powerful things you can offer to any conversation about difficulty. The fifth principle is building momentum through small wins. Conversations, like projects, build psychological momentum, and the direction of that momentum toward resourcefulness or toward helplessness is heavily influenced by how the conversation starts. When you open a meeting or discussion by briefly highlighting something that has recently worked, a solution that was found, a challenge that was navigated, a small win that points toward capability, you prime everyone's brain for solution-focused thinking. before the hard topics arrive. You've established, through evidence rather than assertion, that this is a group of people who find ways through things. This isn't about ignoring the difficult stuff. It's about sequencing it in a way that gives everyone the best possible cognitive foundation for addressing it. Brains primed with examples of successful problem-solving approach. New challenges with greater creativity and confidence than brains that opened a conversation already deep in problem analysis. Start with what's working, then bring the challenges. The quality of thinking you'll get in response will be measurably better. Chapter 9. Building Unshakable Confidence. Through solution mastery. Let's talk about confidence, because there's a version of confidence that's widely understood and a version that actually works, and they're quite different. The version most people pursue is confidence as a feeling, a state you're in, something you either have or don't have on any given day. This version is fragile because it depends on external circumstances, recent successes, other people's validation, absence of recent failures that you don't fully control. The version that actually works is confidence as a track record, an accumulation of evidence that you've faced challenges before and found ways through them. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but through. This version is durable because it's not dependent on how today is going. It's rooted in the demonstrated pattern of your history, and solution-focused thinking builds this kind of confidence in a very specific, very reliable way. Because every time you move through a challenge using the tools you've been developing, you add one more data point to the evidence of your own capability. Over time, that evidence becomes something you can genuinely lean on when a new challenge arrives, and the stress response tries to tell you that this one is different, this one is too much, this one you won't be able to handle. You'll have receipts, a track record, a history of having been wrong about that assessment before. The first strategy for building this kind of confidence is deliberate challenge progression. One of the most effective things you can do is systematically seek out challenges that are slightly beyond your current comfort level, not wildly beyond it, which creates experiences of failure that can be discouraging if they're too frequent, but slightly beyond it, which creates experiences of growth that build the evidence base you're after. Think of it like physical training. You don't build strength by lifting weights that are easy. You build it by lifting weights that are just at the edge of what you can currently manage, heavy enough to require genuine effort, light enough that you can complete the lift and feel the success. Then you increase the weight. The same principle applies to solution-finding capability. You need enough challenge to require real problem-solving and enough success to build confidence. Too much challenge without enough success becomes demoralizing. Too much ease without enough challenge produces stagnation. The sweet spot, where growth happens fastest, is the edge of your current capability. Deliberately seek out that edge. Volunteer for the project that will require you to figure out things you don't yet know how to do. Take on the conversation you've been avoiding because you're not sure how to navigate it. Engage with a goal that feels just slightly out of reach, not recklessly, thoughtfully, but with the understanding that staying in the comfortable zone doesn't build the evidence your confidence needs. The second strategy is solution documentation. Most people solve problems and immediately move on, which means they extract almost none of the confidence-building potential from their own history of success. Keep a simple record of challenges you've navigated, not an elaborate system, just a running note, physical or digital, where you briefly record what the challenge was, what approach you took, what worked, and what you learned. Review it occasionally, especially when a new challenge arrives and your brain is trying to tell you that you don't have what it takes. That record is evidence, concrete, specific, personal evidence that contradicts the narrative your stress response generates about your inability to handle difficulty. It says, in your own words about your own life, I have been here before. I found a way through. I will again. This documentation also serves a second purpose. It starts revealing patterns in how you solve problems most effectively. Over time, you'll begin to notice that certain approaches consistently work well for you, that certain types of thinking consistently produce your best results, that certain conditions help you think most clearly. That self-knowledge becomes an increasingly refined and reliable toolkit, one that gets better the more consciously you build and study it. The third strategy is recontextualizing failure. Here's the truth about the people who are most confidently and effectively solution-focused. They've usually failed more than most, not less. They've tried more things. They've had more approaches not work. They've been wrong more often, but they interpret that failure differently, not as evidence of inadequacy, as data. Every failed approach tells you something real about the situation you're navigating. It eliminates one option. It reveals a variable you hadn't accounted for. It points, often quite specifically, toward what to try differently. This recontextualization isn't something you have to force. It emerges naturally from understanding what failure actually is. Information gathered through the most reliable method available, which is direct contact with reality. No amount of planning produces as accurate information as actually trying something and seeing what happens. When an approach doesn't work, ask, what did this tell me? Not what does this mean about me? That question leads to discouragement. But what did this tell me? That question leads to better next steps. The people who solve the hardest problems are almost always the ones who are willing to be wrong the most times on the way to being right. They've learned that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's part of the process of getting there. The fourth strategy is teaching what you know. One of the most reliable ways to deepen your own confidence and capability in any domain is to help someone else develop theirs. When you help another person think through a challenge using solution-focused approaches, when you ask them the forward-facing questions, help them inventory their resources, guide them through generating options, two things happen simultaneously. You reinforce your own patterns by practicing them, and you gain exposure to different kinds of problems and different kinds of thinking that expand your own toolkit. Look for opportunities to share what you're learning, not as an expert performing expertise, as someone who has found something useful and wants to pass it on. With a colleague who's stuck, a friend facing difficulty, a family member navigating something hard. The informal, genuine human version of this is more valuable than you might expect, both to the person you're helping and to your own development. And notice what it does for your confidence. When you successfully help someone else move from problem-focused spinning to solution-focused clarity, it becomes harder to doubt your own capacity to do the same thing. You've seen it work. You helped make it work. That experience is genuinely confidence-building in a way that no amount of self-directed affirmation can match. Chapter 10. Staying solution-focused. When the pressure is real. Everything we've covered so far is most accessible when you're relatively calm, when the stakes feel manageable, when you have some breathing room to think deliberately and apply the tools you're building. But the moments that most determine the quality of your life, the moments where your thinking patterns matter most, are almost never calm. They're high pressure, high stakes. The situations where the stress response fires hardest, where your brain contracts most dramatically, where the problem-focused default is most insistent. Performing under genuine pressure is where solution-focused mastery gets tested. And it's where most people discover that understanding the principles and actually applying them in the moment are two very different things. So let's talk specifically about how to stay solution-focused when the pressure is real and the stakes are high. The foundation is physiological regulation. Before you can think clearly, you need your nervous system in a state that makes clear thinking possible. And under genuine pressure, that state doesn't come automatically. It requires deliberate intervention. Your breath is the fastest available lever for shifting your nervous system from threat response to clear thinking mode. Not because breathing is magic, but because the specific pattern of your breathing directly signals your nervous system about the level of threat it should be responding to. Slow, deep breathing with a longer exhale than inhale signals safety. It tells your nervous system that whatever is happening is not an immediate physical threat. And your nervous system, receiving that signal, begins to down-regulate the stress response. Your thinking expands. Your access to memory, creativity, and complex reasoning returns. You become capable of solution-focused thinking again. In practice, when you feel pressure mounting, before you respond to anything, take 4 slow breaths. Inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 6. That's it. 60 seconds. It will change your cognitive state measurably and give you access to thinking that the first wave of stress response was temporarily blocking. This is not a relaxation technique for calm moments. It's an emergency tool for high-pressure ones. Practice it in low-stakes situations so it's available automatically in high-stakes ones. The second pressure tool is rapid, clear situation assessment. Under pressure, your brain's instinct is to respond immediately, to act, to react, to do something. This instinct often produces decisions made on incomplete information in a compressed emotional state, which is a reliable recipe for outcomes you'll regret. Before acting, take 30 seconds to assess the situation in the specific, emotionally neutral terms we discussed in the framework chapter. What specifically is happening? What specifically needs to change? What do I actually have available to work with right now? Those 3 questions, answered briefly but honestly, give your brain the specific information it needs to generate relevant solutions, rather than generic stress responses. They move you from reacting to responding, from being driven by the pressure to working within it deliberately. The third pressure tool is rapid option generation. Under time pressure, you don't have the luxury of extended brainstorming, but you also don't have to choose the first option your stressed brain produces, which is almost always either the most obvious approach or the most cautious one, neither of which is reliably best. Give yourself 2 minutes, genuinely set a timer if needed, to generate at least 3 distinct possible responses to the situation. not to evaluate them yet, just to have options. Having three options where you might have had one expands your decision space dramatically and often reveals an approach that's significantly better than what your first instinct produced. Then choose quickly and move. Under pressure, a good decision made promptly almost always outperforms a slightly better decision made too slowly. The action itself generates information. It creates feedback. It gives you something to learn from and adjust based on, which is more valuable than extended deliberation that delays all of that. The fourth pressure tool is future anchoring. One of the most disorienting effects of pressure is temporal. It collapses your focus into the immediate moment in a way that makes the current difficulty feel permanent rather than temporary. You're not just dealing with a hard situation right now, you're experiencing it as the way things are going to be. This distortion makes everything worse. It amplifies the emotional weight of the challenge and reduces your motivation to work through it, because part of you doesn't believe working through it will change anything. The antidote is deliberately expanding your time horizon. Ask yourself, in 6 months, what will I want to have done here? In a year, what decision will I be glad I made in this moment? These questions pull your perspective out of the contracted, pressure-compressed present and reconnect you with the longer arc of your own life, where today's difficult moment is a chapter, not the whole story. From that wider view, the path forward is usually clearer. The decision that serves your actual interests rather than just your immediate relief becomes more visible, and the motivation to do what's hard now, because of what it creates later, becomes more accessible. Leadership plus daily system plus long-term mastery plus action plan. Chapter 11. Your daily operating system for solution-focused living. Let's be direct about something. Everything you've read in this guide, the framework, the reframing tools, the communication principles, the pressure techniques, all of it exists in the category of things you now know. And knowing things is genuinely valuable, but it's not the same as living differently, and the gap between knowing and living is where most personal development effort quietly dies. The reason that gap exists isn't lack of motivation. It isn't lack of intelligence or commitment or desire to change. It's the absence of structure. Without a daily system that makes solution-focused behavior the path of least resistance, that builds it into the architecture of how you actually spend your time, the best insights in the world will gradually fade back into background noise, crowded out by the relentless momentum of old patterns. So this chapter is about structure, about the specific, practical, daily habits that transform solution-focused thinking from something you do when you remember to something you do automatically, because it's built into how your days work. The morning session, 15 minutes that determine everything. Your brain's state at the start of the day creates a template for how it processes everything that follows. The first inputs you give it, the first questions you ask it, the first orientation you establish. These set a cognitive tone that persists, quietly influencing your thinking for hours. Most people begin their days in reactive mode, phone check first, which floods the brain with other people's priorities, problems, and emotionally charged content before it's had any chance to orient toward its own. By the time they've been awake 30 minutes, their brain is already in problem-scanning mode, reactive, defensive, oriented toward managing incoming, rather than creating outgoing. 15 minutes of deliberate morning practice changes this completely. Not a complicated ritual, something simple and consistent. Start by reviewing your current top challenges and, critically, the specific solution-focused actions you've committed to taking today. Not thinking about the challenges. You've already done that. Thinking about what you're doing about them. This single distinction keeps your brain oriented toward movement rather than analysis. Then spend 2 or 3 minutes in solution visualization. See yourself encountering a challenge today and responding with clarity and resourcefulness. See yourself asking the right questions. See yourself moving forward even when the path isn't perfectly clear. Feel what it's like to be the person who finds ways through things. This practice primes your brain's search function for solution-oriented information. For the rest of the day, your mind will be slightly more alert to options and possibilities, slightly more ready to ask generative questions, slightly faster to redirect from problem analysis to solution generation. That slight consistent advantage applied across every conversation and every decision throughout the day compounds into something significant. The decision filter, one question that protects your mental resources. Every day presents dozens of decisions about where to direct your time, attention, and energy. Most people make these decisions reactively, responding to whatever demands are loudest or most immediate, rather than choosing based on what will actually move them forward. A simple filter transforms this. Before any significant commitment of your time or mental energy, ask, will this move me towards solutions or deeper into problems? This question isn't asking whether the activity is pleasant or unpleasant. Some solution-focused work is genuinely hard. It's asking whether this is generative, whether it's creating something, moving something forward, building something, or whether it's recursive, keeping you spinning inside a problem without creating movement. The meeting that will spend 2 hours analyzing what went wrong without generating a single action item. That's a problem-deepening activity. The difficult conversation you've been avoiding that once had will actually resolve something. That's solution-moving. The endless scroll through content that amplifies anxiety. Problem-deepening. The hour of focused work on a challenge you've been procrastinating. Solution-moving. You don't have to apply this filter to every micro-decision, but for the significant choices about where your best hours go, it's worth the 2 seconds it takes to ask the question. Over time, asking it becomes automatic. Your brain starts pre-filtering without conscious effort. The evening review, 10 minutes that extract maximum learning. Most people end their days by stopping. The day happens, it ends, they move into evening, and the learning that could have been extracted from the day's experiences quietly evaporates because nobody asked for it. 10 minutes of deliberate reflection at the end of the day changes the ratio of learning you extract from your experiences dramatically. Ask yourself 3 questions. First, where did I apply solution-focused thinking well today? Don't skip this question in the interest of being self-critical. Identifying what worked is how you understand what to repeat. Second, where did I slip into problem-focused thinking and what triggered it? This builds pattern recognition that makes the next slip easier to catch earlier. Third, what did I learn today that I'll carry into tomorrow? That third question is the most important. It creates a bridge between today's experience and tomorrow's behavior. ensuring that the day's challenges, even the ones that didn't go well, contribute something to your developing capability rather than just costing you energy. Brief is fine. This doesn't need to be journaling in any elaborate sense, a few honest sentences. What mattered is the habit of asking consistently so that reflection becomes part of how you process experience rather than something you do occasionally when things have gone badly enough to force it. Environmental design, making solution-focused thinking the default. Your environment is constantly communicating with your brain. The things you see regularly, the spaces you inhabit, the objects that surround your work, all of it sends quiet, persistent signals about what kind of thinking is normal and expected here. Deliberately design your environment to support the cognitive patterns you're building. Keep visible evidence of challenges you previously navigated, not as trophies, but as reminders. Brief notes about problems you solved that seemed hard at the time. A list of past situations where you found a way through when you weren't sure you could. These aren't decorative. They're functional. They provide your brain with the evidence it needs to counter the stress response's insistence that the current challenge is different, that this one might be too much. Keep your current goals and the specific actions you're taking toward them visible in your workspace, not vague aspirations, specific actions. The goal visible on your wall should connect directly to something you're doing today. This keeps your brain oriented toward forward movement rather than allowing it to drift into abstract worry about outcomes that are months away. Curate your digital environment with the same intentionality. What you consume regularly shapes what feels normal and possible. If your feeds are dominated by content that amplifies anxiety and highlights everything going wrong, that's what your brain will come to treat as reality's baseline. Curate toward content that shows you what's possible. People solving hard problems, ideas about how to think and work better, examples of human ingenuity and persistence, not as escapism, as training. Chapter 12, Scaling Solution-Focused Thinking, How to Lift Everyone Around You. Individual solution-focused thinking changes your life. But something interesting happens when you develop this capability to a real level of fluency. You start changing the people around you, not through lecturing, not through telling people they should think differently, but through modeling, through the consistent, visible demonstration of a different way of responding to challenges that other people can see and feel and begin to absorb. This is how culture changes, not through mandates or mission statements, through the daily behavior of people who think differently and make that thinking visible in how they communicate, what questions they ask, and how they respond when things go wrong. Lead with questions, not answers. The most powerful thing you can do for another person who's stuck in problem-focused thinking isn't to solve their problem for them. It's to ask questions that help them find their own way to solutions. Because solutions they find themselves create capability that solutions handed to them never do. When someone brings you a problem, listen genuinely first. Let them feel heard. Then ask, "What do you think you could do?" Or, "What haven't you tried yet?" Or, "What resources do you have available that you might not be fully using?" These questions aren't deflection. They're the most genuinely helpful thing you can offer because they engage the person's own solution-finding capacity rather than creating dependence on yours. Over time, the people you interact with this way start asking these questions themselves, internally, before they even come to you. You've modeled a pattern of thinking that they've begun to internalize. That's influence that extends far beyond any specific solution you could have provided. Create safety for experimentation. One of the biggest reasons people stay in problem-focused thinking is that their environment punishes failure. When every mistake is scrutinized, when every imperfect outcome becomes a topic of extended analysis, when people feel that trying something that doesn't work will be held against them, they stop trying new things. They retreat to the safest, most defensible approaches. Innovation stops. Problem-solving capability atrophies. The antidote is creating genuine safety for intelligent experimentation, making it clear through your own responses to failure and your visible celebration of genuine attempts that trying something thoughtfully and having it not work is a contribution, not a failure, that the information it generates is valuable, that the willingness to try is exactly what the situation needs. This doesn't mean accepting careless or repetitive mistakes. It means distinguishing between mistakes that come from insufficient attention and mistakes that come from genuine attempts to find better approaches. The first deserve correction, the second deserve acknowledgement and curiosity. Transform how your team discusses challenges. If you're in any kind of leadership or collaborative role, the single most impactful change you can make to the thinking quality of your team is changing how meetings about challenges are structured. Implement one simple rule. For every minute spent describing a problem, spend at least 3 minutes exploring solutions. This ratio isn't arbitrary. It reflects the basic reality that description, beyond what's needed for shared understanding, rarely generates value. Direction does. This means acknowledging challenges briefly and precisely, then moving immediately to what are our options? What resources do we have? What's the most important thing we could address first? Who has ideas? These questions transform the meeting from a problem analysis session into a solution generation session. And the difference in energy and output is immediately apparent to everyone present. When this becomes the consistent pattern of how your team operates, something remarkable happens. People start coming to discussions having already done some solution thinking before they arrive. Because they know that's where the conversation is going, they begin the process earlier. The meeting becomes the refinement of thinking rather than the beginning of it. And your collective problem-solving capability accelerates. Chapter 13, The Long-Term Path. Becoming Someone. Others turn to there's a version of solution-focused mastery that goes beyond personal effectiveness, beyond handling your own challenges well, beyond even influencing the people immediately around you. It's the version where you become, over time, someone that others genuinely seek out when they're facing difficulty, not because you have all the answers, but because being around you makes people feel more capable of finding their own. Because your presence in a challenging situation raises the quality of thinking available to everyone in it. Because you model, consistently and visibly, the belief that solutions exist and that capable people can find them. This isn't a position you apply for, it's one you grow into, through the accumulated evidence of how you show up when things are hard, through the track record of challenges navigated, problems worked through, and people helped to think more clearly, through the quality of questions you consistently ask and the energy you consistently bring to difficulty. Getting there requires one thing above all others: staying on the path long enough for the compound effect to work. Because here's the honest truth about any meaningful change in how you think: it doesn't happen in a week. It doesn't fully consolidate in a month. The early stages feel effortful in a way that can be discouraging if you're expecting transformation to feel smooth and linear. Your brain will revert to old patterns, especially under pressure. You'll have days where problem-focused thinking wins more than solution-focused thinking. You'll apply the tools imperfectly and inconsistently. This is not failure. This is the process. The brain changes through repetition over time, not through perfect performance in individual moments. Every time you catch yourself in a problem loop and redirect to solutions, you've done the work. Every time you ask a forward-facing question when your instinct was a backward-facing one, you've done the work. Every time you stay curious about a challenge instead of contracting around it, you've done the work. The work compounds. Invisibly at first, and then, at some point that's hard to predict but impossible to miss, you'll notice that solution-focused thinking feels like your natural response, not something you're manufacturing, but something that's actually how you think. The loop has changed. The groove runs differently now. Chapter 14, Your Solution-Focused Future, starts right now. You've spent time with a lot of ideas in this guide. And if ideas were enough, the world would look very different from how it does. So let's close not with more ideas, but with a concrete, honest, immediately actionable plan for taking what you've learned from the page into the patterns of your actual life. This week, one thing from each area. Don't try to implement everything at once. That's a reliable path to implementing nothing, because the overwhelm of comprehensive change typically produces paralysis rather than action. Choose one thing from each of the major areas covered here and commit to it genuinely for this week. From the mindset work, practice the solution, interrupt every time you notice yourself in a problem loop. Just that one redirect. What's one thing I could do right now to move this forward? Applied consistently for 7 days, it will begin to change your brain's automatic response in ways you'll actually feel. From the framework, apply the 5-step process to one real challenge you're currently facing. Write it out. Define the problem precisely. Inventory your resources. Generate at least 10 options without judging them. Evaluate and choose. Commit to an implementation step. The act of going through the process once genuinely will make it feel more accessible the next time. From the communication work, pay attention this week to the questions you ask in conversations about challenges. Catch yourself before asking a backward-facing, cause-seeking question and redirect it forward. Just the questions, nothing else. Notice what changes in the conversations as a result. From the daily system, implement the morning session, 15 minutes, current challenges plus committed actions plus brief visualization every morning this week. By day 7, you'll have a felt sense of the difference it makes. And that felt sense is more motivating than anything I could tell you about it. This month, build the evidence base. Start your solution. Documentation. A simple note, physical or digital, where you record challenges navigated, approaches taken, outcomes achieved, lessons learned. Don't wait for big, dramatic successes. Record the small ones. The difficult conversation that went better than expected. The problem at work that you found a way through. the moment you caught yourself in a problem loop and redirected it. These small evidences accumulate into something your confidence can genuinely lean on. Identify one person in your life with whom you can practice solution-focused communication, not as a project or a performance, as a genuine shift in how you engage with them around their challenges. Ask better questions. Create space for their own thinking, rather than rushing to provide answers. Notice what changes in the dynamic. This year, let the compound effect work. The honest trajectory of this work, applied consistently, looks something like this. The first month is effortful and inconsistent. The second and third months feel more natural but still require deliberate attention. By 6 months, you'll notice yourself applying solution-focused thinking automatically in situations where you used to spin. By a year, it will feel like how you think, not something you're doing, but something you are. That's the compound effect. Slow to begin, invisible for a while, and then undeniably transformative. The life on the other side of this shift is not a life without problems. Problems don't disappear because you've learned to think about them differently. What changes is your relationship to them. They stop being things that stop you and start being things you move through. They stop generating the paralysis and helplessness that problem-focused thinking produces and start generating the curiosity and forward momentum that solution-focused thinking creates. You stop being someone who has problems and start being someone who solves them. That's not a small thing. In a world where most people spend most of their mental energy living inside their difficulties, being someone who consistently finds ways through them is a genuine and rare form of power. It shapes your career, your relationships, your creative output, your sense of self, and your capacity to help the people around you in ways that matter. The only question remaining. You now have everything you need. The understanding of why your brain defaults to problem-focused thinking. The framework for moving through challenges systematically. The advanced strategies for problems that won't yield to simple approaches. The tools for rewiring your default patterns. The communication principles that lift the thinking of everyone around you. The confidence-building practices that make this sustainable. The pressure techniques that make it available when stakes are highest. All of it is here. All of it works. All of it is available to you starting right now, with whatever challenge is currently sitting on your desk, or in the back of your mind, or somewhere in the conversation you've been dreading. The question is simply, will you use it? Not perfectly, not all at once, not without setbacks and reversions and days where the old patterns win, but consistently, honestly, with genuine commitment to becoming someone who focuses on solutions, not because it's easier, but because it's more useful, more creative, more genuinely powerful, and ultimately, more true to what you're actually capable of. Your next challenge is already on its way. It doesn't care about your plans or your preferences or your timing. It will arrive when it arrives. The only thing you control is what you do with it when it gets here. Focus on solutions, not because problems aren't real, they are, but because solutions are where everything you want actually lives. Start now.